I ain't thinking about using, I'm thinking about how I could still help somebody. You know, that was not the real selfish me 23 years ago. You know, one of the people that guided me in this process said, Mike, if you expose in the light your secrets, they will die. But if you keep them in the darkness, they will grow and grow, and you will act out. But when there's hope in the mix, anything's possible.
My name is Greg Williams. I'm 29 years old, and I live in a small town in Connecticut. Here are my two best friends in the world, my wife, Michelle, and our dog, Jersey. I'm a big New York Yankees fan, and I hate to shop. Oh, and there's one other thing I should tell you about myself. I'm a drug addict. I can't have a drink or use a drug without wanting more, and without putting my life and my family's life at risk. Here's the thing, though. I'm not supposed to tell you about my addiction. I'm not supposed to want to tell you. I'm supposed to be nervous about what you'll think, how you'll judge me, and how you'll treat me. Chances are I never would have told you about my addiction if I hadn't gotten to know some other addicts over the years and learned about some of the amazing work they've done. I've met crackheads like this guy, who's one of the biggest power brokers in the Rhode Island State Senate. Then there's this burnout. He's a best-selling author. And you probably recognize this pill-popping lush. She's won 2 Emmy Awards. And if you know sports, you know this junkie. Even he'd tell you playing in the NBA is hardly the most important thing he's done. You might be thinking, they don't look like drug addicts, junkies, tweakers, and alcoholics. But that's because my friends and I are people with addiction who don't use alcohol or other drugs anymore. Actually, we prefer to describe ourselves more like this. My name is Greg Williams, and I'm a person in long-term recovery. And for me, that means I haven't used alcohol or drugs since I was 17. Recovery's really given me a gift of a new life. That sounds a little bit nicer now, doesn't it? Amazing what a bit of language can do for you. Amazing also how a guy can learn that he can tell a story somewhere other than in a circle of strangers in a church basement. The cops found my car, and it's crumpled against a tree, and there's blood on the inside. They called my family, and they say, we found your son's car, and it's totaled, and there's blood on the inside, but we don't know where your son is. I still, to this day, don't know what that feels like. You know, my parents have told me a little bit, but I don't know what that feels like. I haven't had to have a drink or a drug since that night. I'm one of 23 million Americans who have found and sustained their recovery. But there are more than 20 million others out there who aren't so lucky.
There is nothing that impacts American life more than addiction. Nothing.
Once you're an addict, and once you're seen in society as an addict, you're something that no one wants in their community. You're that thing that they have to hide.
So many people in our society still think of addicts as homeless people living under bridges, who are wearing trench coats and clutching a paper bag full of whiskey. And that's just not who we are.
Now, in this circle alone, how many of y'all have family or loved ones that vote? Raise your hand. Everybody. We are the largest group of unheard people in the state. AARP, the Old People's Organization, we know about them, don't we? The Susan Komen cancer people, we know about them, right? We know about every issue out there, but people don't know how important the issue of recovery is.
There's nobody in this country anymore who can say they don't know somebody who has suffered or suffering from an addiction.
There's a lot of us. Everyone knows somebody, whether it's a family member, a friend, a sibling. We all know somebody.
Almost 80% of the people now have understanding. If you ask them, they'll say that addiction is an illness. But they still think that large degree that it's a choice at the same time. So they're ambivalent. On one hand, they say it's illness. On the other hand, they say, oh, Johnny could choose to have the illness or not. Like I went to the store and bought an illness, you know.
When I was a little girl playing in the sandbox, being an alcoholic was not a goal. I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a writer. But alcoholic wasn't on the list. The stigma is they're doing it because they want to. And my experience is I didn't become a drug addict because I wanted to.
You're probably expecting to see a picture of the brain right about now to show you what addiction is and what it isn't. Instead, I'll show you what the leader of American drug policy said in 2012, 56 years after the American Medical Association recognized alcoholism as an illness.
We know from the research that's conducted by some of the world's leading neuroscientists that drug addiction, it's not a moral failing on the part of the individual. It's a chronic disease of the brain, and it can be treated. And this isn't my opinion, and it's not a political statement. It's not really open to debate because the evidence is clear and it's unequivocal. It's a fact borne out by decades of study and research, and it is a fact that neither government nor the public can ignore.
But public perception of addiction to alcohol and other drugs continues to be something very different than the science. What that perception does is look at this 15-year-old kid with a genetic predisposition and a still developing brain and suggest I made an independent, rational choice to become addicted.
As a culture, we are still very rooted in you just say no. That's what you do. So a complicated biochemical problem centered in the primitive brain, fueled by your family dynamic and community and your exposure, you just say no to all of it.
There's so much shame, private shame and public intolerance of and public policies that are against addicts and alcoholics. People just still, even in this day, 2012, still don't really get it when it comes to the impact that addiction has, not just in individuals, but in communities.
You may think of addiction as a problem people deal with in private, but the public wreckage is frighteningly quantifiable. Lost productivity in the workplace, increased healthcare costs, and criminal justice expenses add up to $350 billion a year. And 98% of these costs go to cleaning up the mess created by addiction, while only 2% go to preventing or treating it like a health problem.
It's public perception that drives public policy. And if we want to change public policy, we have to change public perception.
In some respects, the media is difficult for us to battle against because the negative news about addiction is dramatic. Rarely do you hear a piece on the news about someone who celebrated 10 years of recovery or 20 years or 50 years of recovery. And we all know those people, but that is not dramatic. That doesn't make the news.
From a small town in Kentucky to a glamorous lifestyle in New York City, Miss USA 2006, Tara Connor began living out her dream come true. But with her success came excessive partying and addiction to alcohol.
To have achieved everything you sought out to achieve.
Right.
Do you know why you blew it?
You know, the thing is because of these stigmas that are attached, I've had people ask me every day, do you think you tarnished the crown? Well, you know, maybe I did. But the bad thing about that is if everyone thinks of alcoholism and addiction or the disease in general as a negative thing, no one's going to want to go get help.
Yeah.
No one wants that stigma attached to them. I'm an alcoholic or I'm an addict.
If there is a media outlet out there that treated it as a health issue, I didn't see it because the only ones that I saw were like, she's a disgrace. And they still call me that, disgrace to Miss USA. 5 years later, 5 years sober later.
You wrote this in your column. The media has no bleeping clue how to cover the death of Whitney Houston. That's because she was slowly dying for years, and many in the press simply averted their eyes.
We looked away.
Bill, I have seen dozens of stories over the years.
But they were sensationalized
detailing the addiction, the erratic behavior, the denial of addiction on the part of Whitney Houston.
They were sensationalized to exploit the woman's condition, not try to help her.
If we look at how the media's handled modern celebrities around issues of addiction and recovery, we find an interesting pattern. One, we find a period of massive coverage when celebrities are self-destructing around problems of addiction. The irony is, the second people achieve stability, they virtually disappear from the airwaves.
A sexy story sells. So, a story about Charlie Sheen going ape last year. That's a story about addiction that sells. It's sexy. It's tragic. But a lot of people made a lot of money off Charlie Sheen because of that.
We don't need more celebrities to step forward and talk about the fact that they're destroying their lives. What we need are celebrities who can step forward and say, my name is, and I'm a person in long-term addiction recovery, and what that means to me is, and tell us that story.
Who's going to do a hey, ladies and gentlemen, welcome?
Great, sure. Where do you want me?
Ladies and gentlemen.
I was mostly inspired to write the book because I'm so sick of feeling embarrassed about being an addict.
Tonight, we are going to get to know the private Kristen. And so through the release of her memoir, Guts, she shared her most intimate thoughts, feelings, failures, shame, and vulnerability by speaking her truth. And little did she know that she would inspire hundreds of others to do the same. Please welcome Kristen Johnson.
I ran into a friend of mine at an LA party, and he said, can I give you some free advice? And I was like, yeah. He goes, you got to stop telling everybody you're sober. And I was like, I'm writing a book about it. And he was like, it makes everyone uncomfortable. And I was so angry. And then I realized that's why I wrote it. I have a terrible, terrible chronic addiction to painkillers and alcohol. And for years I took them, and my stomach ripped open. Well, the shame has always been there. It's like, let's not tell anyone. I refuse to feel ashamed of who I am. I most certainly will not be embarrassed that I'm an addict. So screw my career or my privacy or my mother's sensibilities. I'm gonna tell whoever I damn well want to. You know what was really interesting is when I first spoke about my addiction ever, it was on Letterman.
Here's the lovely Kristen Johnston, ladies and gentlemen.
All I knew was that he was gonna ask me about my addiction. Eventually, it got to the point where I would just, if you had a pill, if you were like, look, I have this pill I found on the subway and it was lint covered and with blood, I'd be like, I'll try it. Really? Yeah. Somebody sent me an article that was written about me in Business Weekly that was like, watch the most honest actress in history mortify Letterman and his audience. And they weren't mortified, they were quiet and listening. And so I wrote her, and I said, you basically said to them, you can never say that you're an addict, because you will be made fun of. That's what we are trained to do. I do that. I look at people and judge them, and think, oh my God, what a mess. And then I have to remember that I'm Courtney Love. I just was never caught. Whether we want to admit this or not, this is our Black Plague. A terrible scourge that is just as deadly as cancer or AIDS. It is destroying people by the untold millions, and I believe without a shadow of a doubt that the shame and secrecy that shroud this disease are just as deadly as the disease itself. It's all of our problems. And if you're not touched by it and you're seeing this movie, you're lying to yourself.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Karen Ziorsky. Karen?
I am a mom who lost her child. 2010, September 9th, I got the phone call that every parent dreads. My 26-year-old son, Ray, his fiance called and said she got home and found my son dead. as a result of the fact that we've had many young deaths in our small, littleish town of Wolcott, Connecticut, about 14,000 people. We have an epidemic with our young people in town. And so I go to Crossroads every Monday night, and I do what I can do. And people say to me, "We have no idea how you can do this. We have no idea what it must be like for you." And I say, "I do this and I'm here because I don't want you to know what this is like for me. If I could help one young person or assist one family of a child with an addiction issue, I would feel as if my son Raymond's death was not in vain, and that's why I'm here today, and that's why I'm doing what it is really, really hard for me to do. This is my new passion. This is what I have to do to make it right for myself and my world. Thank you.
I've heard a lot of parents speak in forums like that, but listening to Karen Zaorski that night hit home hard. I was a young person with a substance use disorder, just like her son, Ray. That could have been my mom up there on that stage. I've been to enough funerals to know not everyone looks at these family stories the way I do. People whisper to one another in receiving lines. The parents must have done something wrong. But from personal experience, I can tell you, it isn't the parents who are failing these young people. It's the health system. If over 23 million people have found answers to one of the largest chronic health problems of our time, then why does our health system not focus on finding better solutions?
Think of the assertiveness, aggressiveness with which we do post-treatment monitoring and early reintervention with people with cancer. And in contrast, what we do with this acute care model of addiction treatment is we hold graduation ceremonies, for God's sakes, and hand people chips and hug them and tell them to have a great life and sever the service relationship. In spite of the fact we continue to use rhetoric that addiction is a chronic disorder, even the most highly stabilized patients at a minimum would be getting at least an annual recovery checkup for 5 years.
I'm a breast cancer survivor, and when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I got off the floor of my oncologist, and there was a big sign that says, "How can we help you with your recovery?" And what happened in that experience is they offered all kinds of support. And at one point I said to the doctor, "How much is this going to cost?" And they said, "Nothing, it's just all part of your treatment. We want you to have the best chance of recovery that you possibly can have." It was very helpful, but it also in some ways angered me because we don't do some of those things with recovery from addiction.
Why don't we have what breast cancer has?
I think because some of it's because of anonymity. We have not had the breadth of people standing up and talking about their experience. And so it's very misunderstood.
There's people who are in recovery but are deeply ashamed of that status because of the incredible social stigma that continues related to that. And I'm going to be very blunt. There are a number of those individuals who may hide behind vague rhetoric about anonymity as a spiritual tradition. But the bottom line is they're ashamed.
For some, yes. For some, I think it is shame. For some, I think they hide behind what they think are rules or expectations or guidelines that they don't completely understand. But for others, it's an idea that their experience of recovery is so sacred to them that they don't feel the need to take it out of the context in which they live it.
Say in the beginning, I freely talked about what happened to me, and I talked about my recovery. There was no shame there. I wasn't afraid to talk about it. Later on, I had a problem with it. I started the business that I'm in now, and when I started that, I had to start to embrace the idea of anonymity at that point, because I can't tell a guy, 4 years ago I'm laying on a mattress in the back of an abandoned building, and now you want me to step in and help you fix your business, your life. So I really couldn't say anything.
Another interview, that's up to you, but I personally...
It was a terrible feeling to have to hide it from someone. It was a terrible feeling to have to lie. When someone says, hey, how come you don't drink? And I'd say, I'm on medication. Or I'd say anything because I didn't want to have to explain that I was an alcoholic. I believe that we were all created with a purpose in our lives. And that purpose for me was to help the alcoholic that still suffers the way that I did. And I wasn't doing that. I think that's what some of the problems are in society. That people hold these secrets and they can't get help if they hold a secret. Where do you go for help if you don't talk about it?
The idea of getting ongoing help and support to overcome alcoholism or drug addiction hasn't always existed. Fortunately for me, and millions of others, many pathways to support long-term recovery are available now. And all of these programs seem to have roots that grew out of the pioneering work of Alcoholics Anonymous.
AA offers help freely to any alcoholic anywhere who is willing to admit his own inability to help himself. And though not a religious organization, its 12-step program calls for belief in some power outside the individual.
It was 1935 when Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith co-founded the first 12-step recovery program. In 1939, the newly formed organization published the book Alcoholics Anonymous, chronicling the stories of more than 100 men and women who had recovered from alcoholism. Very quickly, the title of the book became associated with the fellowship support meetings, where alcoholics could share experience, strength, and hope with one another in a safe environment.
Bill and Bob understood that this idea of two alcoholics talking to each other was simply what helped people stay sober.
Today, recovery goes forward on a vast scale. Our first concern should be for those sufferers of alcoholism that we are still unable to reach.
People talk about Bill Wilson's contribution. What did he do? How did he do this? And I say, he should have won a Nobel Prize for medicine. What was his discovery? At root, his discovery was just this, and it's so simple. The only way he could stay sober was to help another alcoholic. That's what drives these programs all over the world.
Today, AA has a membership of more than 2 million people worldwide. In 2012, the Library of Congress named Alcoholics Anonymous one of its 88 books that shaped America. AA's cultural influence has spawned 258 other fellowships and support groups that use the 12 steps or the name Anonymous in the title of their programs. Anonymity has endured as one of the hallmark tenets of AA. Without it, many suffering alcoholics might have never attended their first meeting. But as important as the practice of anonymity has been to the growth of recovery, it has often been misunderstood, misinterpreted, and misused by both those in recovery and those on the outside looking in.
The public is familiar with programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, but as they're familiar with the 12 steps, what they don't frequently understand are the 12 traditions that really talk more about how the program itself works as an organization.
Anonymity means that I'm not going to go out and say that I am a member of a 12-step organization. And we've had an awful lot of confusion about people saying, I don't want to break the tradition.
I wasn't secret about my drinking. And when I stopped drinking, that wasn't a secret either. and so I didn't really think about anonymity too much. I was taught the spiritual principle of anonymity, which I respect greatly. And I came to understand that the places where people come who are newcomers need to be safe. And I always considered the anonymity tradition to be mostly about the safety for newcomers. I never thought of that as something that I'm supposed to stick my head in the ground and never admit to anybody that I have a disease.
Do you think the Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous contributes to the stigma and discrimination against addicts?
Well, I didn't really have a choice whether I was going to be anonymous or not.
So I often get a lot of grief from my fellows in recovery.
I never got the anonymity thing. Like I really never did. I always thought, well, but there's 30 of us standing in front of a church smoking. Like, what secret is this? You're told as a basic tenet of 12-step life, you're as sick as your secrets, but live the secretive life.
I don't think the founders of 12-step fellowships ever intended people to think about anonymity the way they're thinking about it today. People think that they can't share with anybody that they're in recovery, and that's not what it's about.
This idea that certain fellowships are promoted by attraction rather than promotion. But how is one attracted to anybody within those fellowships if there's no knowledge that anyone is in recovery? So this segregation between the issue of anonymity at the level of press and the issue of anonymity as a spiritual principle and as sort of an antidote to self-centeredness, those are serious concerns that continue to need to be addressed. But anonymity is not secrecy. And anonymity does not prohibit the kind of advocacy that large numbers of people in these fellowships have done almost since their beginning.
The debate over anonymity and the idea that people in recovery should step out of the shadows of their anonymous support groups and push for widespread societal change has been around since the beginning of the AA era.
Alcoholism has too long been a taboo subject, just as tuberculosis used to be 40 years ago. We're trying to teach people the truth, that alcoholism is a disease, and that because it is a disease, it should have no stigma attached to it.
Marty Mann was doing recovery advocacy for many, many decades, and she was Bill Wilson's sponsee. She had Bill Wilson's blessing in doing the work she was doing, educating communities about the realities of alcoholism, and had really sort of set the stage for a lot of recovery advocacy that happened a few decades later.
Marty got sober after just horrendous time with alcohol and not understanding it was a disease. And she began traveling around the country with Dr. Bob and Bill W. And she experienced the stigma, no programs, no services for alcoholics and their families. And she said, this is terrible, we need to do something about it. And Bill and Dr. Bob said, we can't, but you can.
Alcoholics should be dealt with like other sick persons, in hospitals and clinics, not in jails. Alcoholism, America's fourth greatest public health problem, can be solved by community action. The National Committee stands ready to help your community plan such action.
Even as individuals began to develop the understanding they could advocate as individuals, but not as AA members, large numbers of AA members are going to be part of this alcoholism movement all across the country. And in essence, what they're going to try to do is fundamentally rewire how this country perceived and their attitudes towards alcoholism and its treatment.
If a society imprisons those who are sick as a means of getting them well, and dares to call itself an enlightened society, then we need to examine the credibility of our enlightenment.
Harold Hughes played an incredible role in terms of the fulfillment of the advocacy work of the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Here's a guy who's a former truck driver, very charismatic, whose recovery was well known all over Iowa, but was able to win friends and influence people because he was out front and positive and very kind of a populist orientation. And as a result of his advocacy, the Senate allowed him to have a committee on alcoholism.
Alcoholism is a dirty, vicious illness that destroys human life and happiness and causes staggering economic waste. It is disgraceful that we have done so little about it thus far.
Bill Wilson personally appeared before the Senate subcommittee Senator Hughes was overseeing in 1969 and gave personal testimony.
People who have a problem with anonymity should always remember that the first lady in AA and the first man in AA both publicly testified at the first hearing ever held in the United States Senate on that great day in 1969.
It's from a real place of humility, as Bill talks about in this testimony, about from a place of humility just to be included in the conversation, just to realize that my experience can reach to another, even through a policy measure. That's substantial. And it's truly about seeing a system we all know has failed redirect to something that works.
We held our primary hearing in the United States Senate, and I asked 25 major identifiable actors and actresses of the Hollywood community who were known to be in recovery if they would come and testify to give us some national visibility, and was refused by 25. Finally, a friend found a great lady, an Academy Award-winning actress, and she agreed to come and testify at that first hearing, and her name was Mercedes McCambridge. She brought high drama to the hearing room that day.
We are well worth the trouble. We are eminently equipped to enrich this world. We write poetry. We paint pictures. We compose music. We build bridges. We head corporations. We win the coveted prizes for the world's great literature. And too often, too many of us die from our disease, not our sin, not our weakness.
Those congressional hearings in 1969 were nothing short of groundbreaking, not only for bringing the premise of long-term recovery into the public eye, but also setting the stage for 13 different laws that would be passed in the late 60s and early 70s. Laws that established a partnership between the federal government, states, and local communities. Laws designed to build an infrastructure for a public health response to the addiction problem.
That partnership owes a great deal of gratitude, not only to the advocates that led up, but Harold Hughes really pioneering and leading the legislation that's going to lay this foundation, which really set the stage for a really dramatic moment in the history of advocacy in the country, which was a project called Operation Understanding in 1976.
The National Council on Alcoholism brought 50 people here, all distinguished in various fields, including politics, sports, and entertainment. All are recovered alcoholics, and this is the first time some of them have publicly revealed their problem.
NCA was founded by a woman who is an alcoholic. Not was, but is. Although I stopped drinking over 35 years ago.
I've had pink fingers pointed at me now for 15 years, either because I was drunk or because I was sober. I'm sort of getting tired of the finger being pointed at me. But if the finger that points at me will help somebody else get sober, I'm not ashamed of it.
It was a phenomenal event and included people like astronaut Buzz Aldrin, included actors like Dick Van Dyke and Gary Moore, baseball stars like Don Newcombe and Ryan Duran, politicians like Congressman Wilbur Mills, Senator Harold Hughes, and others.
People who this country dearly loved, and we're so shocked to see these individuals sort of stepping out of the shadows and announcing themselves as people in recovery. An enormous turning point in the history of not only advocacy, but in the history of attitudes towards alcoholism.
I think that all these illustrious individuals who are here are hoping that the stigma that's always been attached throughout history to the disease of alcoholism will be somewhat removed. This might be the beginning. It is a disease.
There was folks tired of being blamed and being shamed and wanting very much to be seen in a positive light, angry, because advocacy is about anger, and knowing that by their voices being heard around the world, you give voice to others.
The message here today is that alcoholism is a treatable disease, one without a stigma that can afflict anyone.
Operation Understanding should have been a tipping point in the movement to transform the landscape and the cultural understanding of addiction and recovery. It should have been the launching point for a national understanding of what was needed for people in recovery. Programs to permanently support them, and a society to accept them. But instead, all that progress was undercut before a recovery revolution could even really start.
Following the Operation Understanding, we're going to see a real reversal of some of the positive changes that had begun to unfold in the United States.
So in the crusade for a drug-free America, the next step is to enforce a policy of zero tolerance of illegal drug use. So when we say no to drugs, it'll be clear that we mean absolutely none.
Ah, yes, the drug war. Just as the recovery movement's pioneers were starting to make a dent in the court of public opinion about those addicted to alcohol, the leaders of the free world were teaching us that drug addicts like me were the biggest threat to America.
Drugs are menacing our society.
If someone offers you drugs, what will you do?
No, 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 no thanks, no way.
Just say no.
With the 80s, we probably had the most intense period of criminalization within American history.
The ghettoization of cocaine is what resulted in these very harsh drug policies. And a lot of that had to do with, the crack epidemic.
In the alphabet of illegal drugs, few have become so popular, so potent, so addictive, so fast as what's known on the street as crack.
There is growing evidence that the nation's crack cocaine epidemic is taking a new and dangerous turn.
A drug so pure and so strong, it might just as well be called crack of doom.
Officials are determined to crack down on crack.
It's another night, another crack raid.
See this cute little vial here? It's crack, rock cocaine, the most addictive form.
We were going to try to incarcerate our way out of the addiction problem and its related problems. And we couldn't build prisons fast enough.
If you sell drugs, you will be caught. And when you're caught, you will be prosecuted. And once you're convicted, you will do time. Caught, prosecuted, punished.
The idea was that we would use these draconian sentencing laws to get the drug kingpins, and it absolutely didn't work. It was an attempt to really deal with very complex problems in an oversimplified way.
Cocaine addiction was overwhelmingly white. The images that came across TV were inner city images of young black men dealing crack cocaine on street corners, or African American infants trembling in perinatal intensive care units. And the moral panic behind that created not only a set of draconian laws in response to that epidemic, but it began to force large numbers of recovering people back out of the public light and in shadows for their own self-protection.
Our most serious problem today is cocaine, and in particular, crack. Who's responsible? Let me tell you straight out. Everyone who uses drugs, everyone who sells drugs, and everyone who looks the other way.
While our leaders believed they could just simply arrest our way out of the drug problem, there was one man who wasn't willing to go down without a fight.
By the early 90s, there was a lot of threats against treatment, and Senator Hughes, being a politician and a policymaker, recognized what was going on. He said, you can't have good policy without good advocacy.
I felt reasonably comfortable that we had made enough progress by 1975 when I left the Senate without worry about what would happen in this area of addiction disease. I was wrong.
Largely, people in the recovery community walked away and said, well, we've done our thing. We're recognized now. We need to now be quiet and go back, in our hole.
Recognizing that, Harold used attempts by an organization called SOAR to rebirth this advocacy movement.
Part of the problem we got is the very language that we use. And until we start using the right language, declaring that it is a disease, and saying we've got well instead of saying I'm a happy recovering alcoholic after 50 goddamn years, when do I get well?
The idea of the Society of Americans for Recovery, or SOAR, was to provide an opportunity for people in recovery to come forward and advocate for those that were still suffering.
I won't argue the semantics of what I'm talking about. If you want to sit in the meetings and get up and say to one another, I'm a happy recovering alcoholic, you go right ahead. I want you to do more than that. Go in there and do that, but then get out on the battlefield if you feel so led. And tell America you got well. And if you can't, then at least pray for us. If you think we're wrong, then cuss us. don't just sit idly aside.
Senator Hughes' vision, he talked about having 1 million people in recovery joining, and so he really laid out this vision of a movement.
I know that in a way I'm preaching to the choir. But if the choir won't sing the praises of God, then who else will?
Harold Hughes would continue to work towards his vision for an organized recovery movement until he passed away in 1996. Significant steps forward continued to be hard to come by. But elsewhere in the healthcare sphere, another crisis emerged. Another disease with a terrible stigma, but one whose advocates succeeded in changing public perception and earning support.
Remember back in the early 80s when nobody wanted to get near anybody who had AIDS? Oh, it's a gay man's disease, and you deserve to get AIDS because you had anal sex with another man, and that's dirty and that's wrong, and you deserve this. Well, then people like Princess Diana came forward and went to AIDS hospices and put her arms around people who had AIDS and said, you are not going to go through this alone. Then AMFAR was founded by Elizabeth Taylor. Then Magic Johnson came forward as a straight man and said, I have HIV. And we know what's happened in the last 30 years. Billions of dollars have been raised and millions of people have been saved.
I always look to the gay community for guidance, because if they had said, oh, that's anonymous, we can't talk about HIV, where would that be? So they really understood right away that silence was going to kill the entire community, that they had to organize and they had to demand a different approach to the problem of HIV.
For AIDS, hope came only after those impacted decided they'd had enough and refused to stop until they'd gotten a new response to the disease. The roots of the AIDS movement were on the ground, with small groups courageously stepping forward. The addiction movement saw this, and in the late 90s, advocates began to pick up the pieces of the fractured, organized recovery movement.
I began to see in 1997 and 1998 the rise of these little grassroots recovery advocacy organizations again. But these were birthed all by recovering people, beginning to talk about a vision of organizing recovery supports for people in their communities.
The things they wanted to talk about was recovery, which nobody was really talking about in that kind of way then, and what kinds of things were conducive to recovery, what things in the community supported recovery. It was a very, very different conversation that had been had before.
If the public saw that people recovered, they'd be more likely to support all those programs that help people get into recovery. So our whole foundation was laid on the idea of putting a face on recovery.
How are we going to mount a recovery advocacy movement that's different than anything we've ever done? And a group of us realized we needed to go get some money and try to fund this recovery advocacy work in some sort of cohesive, coordinated fashion.
In 2001, people in recovery came together in St. Paul, Minnesota to launch this new national campaign. And they spent 2 years planning this event because no one knew whether or not people in recovery would be willing to come together and organize, just like people with other health conditions have.
But the key issues still remain, how do we create some connecting tissue around all of us as these small fledgling organizations? And so what we did was we created an organization called Faces and Voices of Recovery.
That meeting became the turning point the recovery advocacy movement so badly needed, stitching together not only so many smaller organizations, but also unifying principles and ideas for the battle against the discrimination of people with addiction. One of the first initiatives was recovery message training, giving people a new language to share their recovery stories with a purpose, with the goal of hitting the stigma right between the eyes.
So we've all kind of identified ourselves in a number of different ways, right? We all have this different relationship to recovery, a different relationship of why we're here. We're going to make a list of all the different ways that the words that we use to describe addicts, alcoholics. So what are some of the common phrases or words that other people use to describe us? Junkie. Okay. I heard lush, junkie.
Low life.
Alky, low life. Loser. Bum, liar, thief, crackhead, pothead, dope fiend. Why was it easy for us to think of this list so quick? Because we've been called those things, right? We've been identified by those things. What is the common denominator of all these words up here? They're negative, right? So the name of this training is Our Stories Have Power. We know that a lot of people have want to address the issue of stigma related to recovery, and this is a great way to do that, to learn how to talk about your recovery in a way that's not going to feed into the negative public perception.
You walk people through it. You let people get to know you first, and you determine when it's appropriate to disclose. And in the way you disclose, I think how you share it with people, I think is just as important as what you're sharing. I think
when you get elected to the Senate at age 25, you have a certain sense of invincibility or power. And it's contrary when people are telling you that you have a problem with alcohol or other drugs, that you can't handle that, but you can handle this. The more I drank, the more I wanted to drink, the worse it got. The Senate was redistricting, and we were going from a 50-member Senate to a 38-member Senate. And the folks in the leadership thought I couldn't handle being here anymore and eliminated my Senate seat. After being out of office 3 or 4 months, I was arrested for possession of cocaine. When you go from being a lawmaker to a lawbreaker, that's a good story for the press.
Cuffed, thin, and strung out, the courts ordered Kader to rehab.
And that's when I ended up going to treatment and getting into recovery.
Let me introduce myself. My name's Tom Kader. I am a person in long-term recovery, and for me that means that I haven't used drugs or alcohol since May 15th of 2003. And as a result, guess what's happened? My life's gotten a whole lot better. For me, recovery is really about a transformation of my life. Today I'm the Chief of Staff to the Senate President in Rhode Island, and that's a gift of recovery.
I would cringe regularly at the things I would hear people say publicly about their recovery.
First thing that's not in the message is I'm an addict or an alcoholic. When the general public hears the word addict or alcoholic, they think of somebody who's still using. That's not in our message. We don't use that.
I realized that people in recovery didn't have a lot of training about how to talk about their own recovery. And when I first went to Faces and Voices of Recovery, they said, we've developed some messaging, this will help you. And when I took that training for the very first time, it was transformative.
How many of us have, when we first got into recovery, we felt like we had been dropped on another planet? The recovery community has its own language. It has its own terms and definitions. When we say something to each other, we almost know what we're talking about, but out in the general public, they may not.
I remember coming back to the State House for the first time and standing in the rotunda with a microphone in my hand and screaming from the top of my lungs that I was a person in long-term recovery and that I had once served in this building, and now we're here to take it back.
We're lucky today. There was a time when it wasn't okay to be public about your recovery. For many of us, we were afraid of the discrimination we'd face if people found out. Well, thanks to all those who came before us and showed the courage to tell their recovery stories, the faces and voices of recovery, we can be here today at a national party convention showing that recovery is indeed a reality.
When I went around the country, I realized this is something that we really need to train more people to do. If we can train recovery armies how to talk about their recovery, we'll be able to affect public policy, not just in Washington, but in all 50 states.
My name is Carol McDade, and I'm a woman in long-term recovery. And for me, that means I've been alcohol and drug-free for almost 15 years. And my recovery's allowed me to become a wife, a mother, and a recovery advocate like many of you.
I can remember when I called my parents and said, that deposit that you made to George Washington for law school, well, I'm not going to go there this fall. I'm going to become a lobbyist. And my mother was like, a lobbyist, Carol Ann, that's similar to a streetwalker.
As a founding board member of Faces and Voices of Recovery, Carol McDade has been on the front lines of the new organized recovery movement. But as a lobbyist, she has also been firmly focused on another mission: advocating for better laws. Her biggest victory so far is the passage of the 2008 Mental Health and Addiction Equity Act, ending health insurance discrimination for people with addiction. But the path there hasn't been easy.
In '96, Congress did pass a parity bill for mental illness, but it specifically excluded addiction treatment. And the reason why it excluded it was because a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle were sort of wary about expanding access to care for substance abusers.
In 1996 is when we were in the heat of the battle on what was then the Mental Health Parity Act. And I had a senator who took me aside and said, Carol, I'd love to help you out with this, but, it's not a great issue. No one cares about it. And let's be frank, Carol, addicts don't vote. My challenge was laid out in front of me to make sure that we became a constituency of consequence.
Some of you know, on July 31st, 1981, I woke up from my last alcoholic blackout under arrest for a variety of offenses. And I'm alive and sober today only because of the access I had to treatment.
When I first started working on the parity bill, I had colleagues and friends in Washington on both sides of the aisle who would come up to me and say, Jim, I really admire your own personal recovery, but, if I get on this bill, I'll never get reelected. Because the people back home don't believe addiction is a disease. They think it's a moral weakness or moral failing.
It's a national crisis that untreated addiction and mental illness cost our economy over $550 billion last year.
We had one call-in day, when everyone calls a 1-800 number to ask for a bill to be put on the House floor. And we had 10,000 phone calls go into Nancy Pelosi's office. And that was really a tipping point.
The battle for insurance parity was ultimately won for the reasons recovery advocates have been talking about for years. People in recovery finally came out of the shadows and stood up as engaged citizens. But even though this legislation has provided some progress, in truth, no single law can correct decades of problematic policy. But that doesn't mean the recovery movement is giving up, because guys like John Shinholzer just aren't wired to give up.
You can be a convicted felon for a crack pipe, right? 5 years, convicted felon for, and that crack pipe, you bought it legally at the mini mart for $1. You can legally buy a crack pipe for $1. The state made a 5 cents tax on that dollar, but yet they're going to make you a felon when you get busted with it and put you in jail and prison for up to 5 years. So they get to spend $100,000 where they made a nickel. When I grew up, a felon was somebody who raped somebody or killed somebody, murdered somebody. It wasn't somebody who bought a piece of glass legally and did something illegal with it.
John knows plenty about influencing policy. He's married to Carol McDade. They've been called Recovery's Power Couple. And through their McShin Foundation, they do as much to save the lives of people with addiction as anyone in the country. And it all started when John and Carol saw a treatment system in their home state of Virginia that simply didn't work.
In 2004, he and I were really frustrated that we lived in a state with all the work we did. He'd always worked with people in recovery, and that you had to wait 32 days for a treatment bed in the state of Virginia. It was just unacceptable, and people were dying. And so we started a recovery community organization called the McShin Foundation. We have people who are, leaving jails and prisons, and we have people who are on trust funds.
In the 1980s, we had 3,500 quality rehabs around America. And then an organization called HMOs came along. And HMO's main purpose was to whack reimbursement for medical services for big corporate America, save them money. The first industry that they cut out reimbursement for was the treatment center industry. And they did that because, A, the recovery people had no advocacy organization, and B, it was a shame-based disease that they knew nobody was going to rise up and say anything, because most of the recovering people were members of anonymous programs who were brainwashed to think they can't talk about being in recovery.
Politics is probably the #1 barrier for recovery. If these politicians, if these bureaucrats would just step aside, listen to the recovery people on what works and what doesn't work, we can change the course of history with addiction in America. But they would have to resolve to the fact that they would probably reduce recidivism, that they would probably reduce the need for a big criminal justice system. And I'm not sure they're ready to come off of that right now.
When is the best time to help an addict? Now, when they ask for help, the best time to help when an alcoholic or an addict or a loved one we've been dealing with for 10 years, I've been telling you you had a drinking problem, and then all of a sudden you call up on a Sunday morning and said, brother, sister, mother, father, I have a problem, I need help. That is the window of opportunity, which is really short. That window closes. When does that window close? Real quick. An hour? 15 minutes? 5 minutes? Whatever. You go to a community service provider, they say come back in 25 days. Have you lost your mind? You know how many circular saws you're going to steal from Home Depot in 25 days? Not only that, but when you get busted for stealing from Home Depot, they give you services immediately. You get arrested right away. You get $50,000 a year worth of services immediately. And all that could have been avoided if the community service boards would have said, come, we got you covered right now.
They have gone to a lot of effort to build the perfect typewriter. It's a beautiful typewriter. It's magnificent. Best typewriter you'll ever see or use in your life. Unfortunately, we're in an internet era. We have word processing, computers, and internet. The McShin Foundation, the recovery support service provider, the authentic recovery movement is the internet age. We're the word processor. Our state agencies are stuck on that perfect typewriter.
Our jails and our prisons are full of addicts and alcoholics. They're all pulled up in one spot. I've never been to a jail or prison yet where I couldn't walk into and say, okay, who wants to talk about addiction and recovery, and have most of the population say, yeah, that's exactly what I'd like to talk about while I'm here.
The McShin Foundation is renowned for its community-based work. But what really sets this organization apart for me is its devotion to helping a particular group of people. A group many, including the government, have left hanging. Men and women in prison on drug charges. In the city jail in Richmond, McShin's programs have only begun to scratch the surface of what can be achieved behind bars.
The recovery program is men in recovery, and we all are recovering from something, but here at Richmond City Jail, we believe in them being proactive and not reactive. And so what's going on is that we're preparing them to go back out in the world, and that is the pre-care here and the aftercare when they get out in the world. And John Chinholster and his group have been working in and out here, volunteering in Richmond City Jail since I've been here, preparing them to deal with themselves and to make them better citizens instead of better criminals.
You get to be a part of somebody understanding that they're not a bad person, they're a sick person. And I can selfishly confess that helping other people build their recovery sustains my own. So it helps me stay clean and dry to help them stay clean and dry, and that's the way that it works.
I mean, my first time in jail, it was drug related. And if I was introduced to recovery then, I know my life would have been different. Like I said, I never even thought about treatment. I thought everybody got high. Because from my neighborhood, that's what everybody got high. So I just thought it was a way of life. And now I know it's not.
We were studied recently by the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Public Policy Analysis, and we reduced recidivism by 18%. People who stay in our program for 6 months are 18% less likely to come back to jail than other people who come to this jail, because we equip them with things that help them to understand that they have other choices.
The Men in Recovery program for just 120 inmates has not only reduced recidivism, but over the last 4 years has saved the city of Richmond $8 million. A few miles east, at a prison run by Sheriff Michael Wade, the impact of an entire peer-based recovery wing is just as clear.
Yeah, some of the concerns about having a program like this is people think there's less discipline and y'all have more freedoms and all. I guess the question to ask you think you have more freedom here or more freedom in the other part of the jail?
I think there's more freedom in the other part of the jail. I mean, you can do what you want, really sleep all day if you want. I don't know, you don't have to get up to go to chow, but here it's more discipline. You have to get up, actually make your bed, be accountable for your actions. You have to go to every meal. And also just getting the education, knowing, there's life after this. It kind of gives me hope, and it's a real positive thing.
So you get discipline, education, and hope.
Yeah.
What a concept. You just nailed it right there.
This is my fourth time getting ready to go to prison. I got 4 years for a technical violation. I gave 3 dirty urines, and I actually got accepted to a 2-year residential program, but my my probation officer thought that I needed to go back to prison.
If you got 4 dirty urines, recovery is what you need, not prison. Hello.
To be quite honest, I could bond out and have chosen not to take this program. I need this.
There's a movement taking place in America where we're actually recovering people, trying to get other recovery people to step up, be a positive face and voice for recovery, for the community. Because the more of us that step forward and tell our story, the more these people are going to believe it, and the better chance we're going to have to change this system.
We got a lot of future soldiers coming. I would not want to be a policymaker 10 years from now and try to do some of that dumb stuff that they're doing today and getting away with. They won't get away with it 10 years from now.
I want you to know that 1 in 3 teenagers in the United States meet the medical criteria for addiction. 1 out of every 70 will be going to rehab. I decided that I wanted to help build a sober high school in New York City, and they won't say yes. The Board of Education. They've said yes to 600 schools this year.
The idea that we're recovering our kids are less important than kids interested in automotive repair or desktop publishing, because there are designated high schools in this city for automotive repair, for desktop publishing, for history, for all those things. There is not a designated high school for people in recovery, and we don't advocate for that.
There are 4 in the Boston area. There's 0 in New York State or city. What the fuck is that saying to our kids? I don't even like teenagers. But somebody has to fucking do it.
Of all those in need of help, kids hit home with me the hardest. Just like me, 9 out of 10 people with a substance use disorder started using before they turned 18. Helping young people find and sustain their recovery is one of the most important things we can do. And the power that recovery-focused schools can have is incredible to see.
What I can tell you about my experience at this school is that it's been one of monumental importance, not only to my education, my life, and building personal relationships back, but also my recovery.
Independence Academy is one of the best schools I've ever been to, and I've been to a lot in the past couple of years due to drugs and alcohol and all that. And it is nothing like a regular high school. None of these schools are like regular high schools. It's not even like you don't feel like you're going to school. It's like coming home all the time.
There's a growing number of young people who face this issue, and we're trying to create an awareness that exists, that there are services that can help a young person with this issue. And once they get into recovery and sobriety, old people, places, and things is what brings anyone in recovery down, especially adolescents. If they get sober and they go back to the same school, hang out with the same people, and do the same things they did before, their chances of staying sober are almost 0. And that's what we're trying to do with recovery high schools, is once they make that effort to get sober, give them a place they can come to where they can continue to grow, not just academically, but socially and emotionally.
Hi, I'm Josh. Really grateful to be here and to be asked to have read this. It's called Grace Given. On my own, left in the wastes, only to wander in the dark alone. Strange noises corrupt my thoughts. The slightest touch from the unknown will send me astray. I had run so many times. I was so tired. The unknown came for me, and I gave in. As a captive, they showed me their ways, gave me the strength, hope, and the ability to leave. I chose to stay. Grace given, grace I never had.
We're seeing a recovery school movement in the United States, including the Boston Recovery High School that I had the privilege of coming in early yesterday and visiting. We're seeing collegiate recovery programs. I go to a large campus and I walk into an open recovery support meeting on the campus, and I'm stunned to see 200 students in the room. This is in an abstinence hostile environment, agreed? Which is how I would characterize most colleges and universities in the United States.
The partying on college campuses would truly jeopardize somebody's education to the point where I would imagine a lot of people would either relapse or leave if they don't have support. Because if college life is sort of organized around being with your peers, and all your peers are drinking and getting high, and you're trying not to drink and get high, I don't know how long you can keep that up, frankly. If you can prevent relapse at the high school level and the college level, you would have a lot more than 23.5 million people in recovery. And you probably also would have a lot fewer than 23 million people addicted, because it would become part of a culture.
I didn't actually end up using until I got to college. You know, I was let me drink until I got drunk, because I didn't know how to deal with the anxiety that I was feeling of being somewhere new and being somebody that I didn't know anymore. And it was hard. So eventually I found somebody who was using crystal meth. And that was kind of where it just it was it. Like one time, that's all it took.
Devin, James, McCoy, Fox.
It was like a couple years later and a couple of rehabs later that I finally entered into my own process of recovery and identifying that my life needed to make a change.
You know, I entered into recovery when I was 20 years old. And about a year into it, I decided that it was time for me to go back to school. And I was really scared. I was really, really nervous, because when I started to drink and then use drugs, I started when I was in school, when I was 18 years old. And I was deciding to go back to the same school that I was at. And the beautiful thing is that the school that I went to is Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And they have had a collegiate recovery program for 25 years.
When I first met Devin, he told me how serious he was about recovery, and he was nervous about the recovery house. And I said, why are you nervous about the recovery house? He says, I want to make sure that they're as serious as I am. So, that sounds good. Come right in. You know, you're accepted. Let's go.
The recovery house has given me the place to be where I felt safe. You know, it didn't keep me clean, but it gave me somewhere where I felt like I could go home, I could rest my head at night, and not necessarily worry that somebody across the hall from me was getting high. You know,
my title is Recovery Advocate for the state of New Jersey for the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services. What? Who gets that? You know, that's insane. I used to smoke crystal meth.
I really, really urge you to consider expanding the continuum of care to include recovery support. Because without recovery support services, I wouldn't be here today. You know, I tried to kill myself 2 times, and I didn't think I was going to go back to school. And if I didn't go back to school, I wouldn't have graduated with my bachelor's. I wouldn't have graduated with my master's. I wouldn't have stayed in the momentum, and I wouldn't have gotten my job at the division. You know, and I wouldn't have had the opportunity to stand here and be this person in front of you. You know, and I think that speaks for itself. So thank you.
Young people like Devin Fox, programs like Rutgers and the Boston Recovery High Schools offer promising evidence of the future of the recovery movement. But still, the reality is they are the exceptions. Currently, there are only 16 states with recovery high schools and just 20 states with collegiate recovery programs. It's all the more frustrating when you consider what recovery schools are. They're simply communities where people with addiction can find positive peer support. No different really than any other successful recovery program. If I've learned anything in my travels, it's that the founders of AA got it right. Community, maybe more than any other tenet, is the backbone of the recovery movement.
Don Coyas from White Bison, when he stands up and says, the individual, the family, the tribe, and the community are one. To harm one is to harm all. To heal one is to heal all. And what he really says is what historically we did was, it was as if we saw addiction as a sick and dying tree, and that we would dig this tree up and move it all the way over here to another area, maybe even another community, and replant it in healthy soil and give it water and fertilizer and sun and nurture it and love it back to health. And when it came alive again and became vibrant, we would dig it up and bring it back and replant it into the same hole, and then be shocked when the tree began to get sick again. And Don's message in all of this is, it's time we began to not just treat individual trees, but to begin to treat the soil as well.
Our communities have traditionally had an acute response to what we know today is a chronic health problem. And we're starting to realize there are better ways to support long-term recovery. Community centers have begun to pop up all across the country, whose primary purpose is offering ongoing support for people in recovery and their families. If we are going to truly begin to treat the soil, these are the kinds of places people need to recover. Places that aren't going anywhere. Places where they can feel safe and always welcome.
It started in 2004 when we opened our first recovery community center. And it was based on the field of dreams, build it and they will come. And when you look at our foot traffic today in our 3 centers, they average 15,000 visits a year. So people are coming.
It was radical to be able to hang a shingle on Main Street that said Recovery Community Center, and that people went in the front door with a great deal of ownership and pride that they were citizens of the town and they belonged to the Recovery Community Center. So it made recovery visible and, if I can say, proud.
Sure, I'm trying hard to stay in recovery because I don't want to go back where I came from. And I'm following my programs. I go to probation. I never did that before. I go to mental health. I never did that. And I'm just maintaining in recovery. So I just wanted to say thank y'all for all the support that y'all giving me. And I'll pass with that.
We have to believe that this is a valuable commodity, because every time you see somebody in recovery getting well, you know that the community is healing. Families are healing. It's like throwing a rock into the water, and that ripple effect. It would just make more of a connection for people that the state will not only benefit, but our communities will benefit.
People don't recover in treatment. People initiate recovery and treatment. People will recover in their communities. It makes no sense to me that we work with people, we help them to engage in recovery, and then we put them back into communities where they're not going to be supported, where they may not have the supports that they need, where there in fact may be things going on that actually undermine their recovery.
It's about maintenance. Yeah. Maintenance. Exactly. Recovery is hard, man. The easiest part was kicking it.
Put it down.
The hard part is living it.
Here in Detroit, our 2 biggest challenges for people in recovery is adequate living arrangements and employment. And so if we can address those 2 aspects, we have began to solve the problems in our community as well as the problems of the world. You have a group of people who are the humblest people I've ever met on this earth, but their spirits are strong. You can feel the spirit of that person yearning for recovery, and you can feel that same spirit when people have totally internalized and embraced this whole recovery program. It's like a light shining inside of people.
As we begin to be more effective in learning how to
deal with this illness and how to really help people access and sustain long-term recovery, we're also having a huge impact on their families and their children and other people that see them. And that hope for recovery is going to spread like wildfire.
There's 25 million people that suffer from this illness. And they say that only 2.5 million get help. So that leaves around 22 million off to the side. And out of that 22 million, that leaves about 50 million broken hearts, like my Chris, Sammy, and Drew, and my wife. And I don't think you can put a stat on broken hearts. I don't think you can see what that fallout will come of for those people who are left untreated.
Along with everything else, we need leaders. We need people proud of their recovery. People who encourage others to be proud of their recovery. People who everyone else will listen to. We need people like former NBA player Chris Herron.
Since I started shaving, I did it in the shower. 32 years old, 9 months sober. I did it in front of the mirror for the first time in my life. It was a pretty powerful moment for me. And I think if you ask most people, they don't pass the mirror test, where they could really look and say, I like it. I can pass the test today because of recovery. The only reason. I spoke at a school where these 5 little kids, they walked in and they sat in the front row and they had on these solid purple shirts. And I looked at these kids with the solid purple shirts and I was wondering who they were the whole assembly, because all their classmates were dressed different. And at the end of the assembly, this little girl, 17 years old, she raised her hand. When I called on her, she stood up. Now, I've spoke at West Point. I've spoke at Annapolis. I spoke at Notre Dame, New England Patriots, Chicago Bears, Green Bay Packers, Boston Red Sox. Nobody stands up. This little girl popped up, and with a big smile on her face, she said, Mr. Herron, I just want to thank you for coming here today and finally validating what me and my 4 friends do. And I looked at that little girl and I said, what do you do? She said, we're the sober students of this high school. And this girl's shining moment crumbled a second later because the whole school started laughing at her. That little girl sat down, started crying. I looked at the kids laughing and I said, shame on you. I looked at that little girl, and at 35 years old, the only thing that came out of my mouth that day was, I wish I liked myself enough. I wish I never had to change myself. I wish I could walk around as myself. I looked at that little girl and I said, I give you every uniform I've ever put on in my life. Knowing what I know today, to go back to 17 years old, sitting in that front row and wear the purple shirt with you. I want kids to walk away and say, you know what, he's kind of cool. It's kind of cool to be sober. Recovery's cool. You know, it's not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of regret and shame. You know, it's not a scarlet letter. It's not any of that. It's cool, you know? It's okay, man. Like, you overcame. If 30 million people suffer from this, that's around 60 million family members. So our numbers are unbelievably strong, but yet we have no voice. And I think we have to let go of that shame and the guilt and all of that and come forward with it. Wow, the dream is that it's not the most underfunded health issue in this country. The dream is that we're worth more than 5-day detoxes. When diabetics go off their sugar and they show up to the emergency room, they get treated with great empathy. They level them off, they put them in a room, they feed them, they give them the correct right food. An addict walks in after a relapse, and he's thrown back on the road. Hopefully someday we won't be looked upon as that, throwaways. You know, because you step over me, you step over little Chris, you step over Sam, you step over Drew, you step over my wife. You step over that one addict, you're stepping over a whole family. And there's heavy fallout and repercussions for that. I'm a sober dad. You know what I mean? There's nothing better than that.
If we're not politically engaged, then we're leaving this to someone else. And if we could ever tap those 20-some million people in long-term recovery in this country right now, to say that they're willing to put their hand up and be a face and voice of recovery, you change this overnight.
My name's Greg Williams, and I'm a person in long-term recovery. And for me, that means I haven't used alcohol and drugs since July 15th, 2001. For my first 4 or 5 years in recovery, I never told anybody, that wasn't in a church basement that I was in recovery. If I don't put my last name out there and if I don't stand up publicly, for me, the general public reads between the lines, and they think I'm ashamed of my recovery. And that's not why I was going up to the legislator. That's not why I was speaking out. It's not because I was ashamed about being an addict. I was proud of my recovery. I was proud to reunite with my family. I wasn't ashamed. The journey will continue, my journey, and the journey that's been ongoing in this country for 80 years. Together, we are creating a new reality, one where people in recovery don't want to stay anonymous, but instead will proclaim their recovery loudly and proudly, where addiction will be treated like the chronic disease it is, not a moral failing, and certainly not a crime. In a new reality where people in recovery know wherever they are, support is always just around the corner, in whatever form they may need it. New soldiers join this growing movement every day. People in recovery, their families, and their friends, coming together in the annual marches that began in September 2000, celebrating what they've accomplished, making a statement about what is to come, and demonstrating that the new reality is not far away.
All right, I want you to look around because this is what active recovery looks like. This is what active recovery looks like.
As a person in long-term recovery from an illness that has no cure, but an illness that has a solution.
I would not be standing here today, continue bettering myself as a man, as a father, owning a home. Everything that recovery has given me today, I got it. So now it's my turn to teach you that recovery works.
I'm not afraid to take a stand, take a stand. Everybody, come take my hand, come take my hand. Walk this road together through the storm, whatever weather, cold or warm. Just let you know that you're not alone. Holler if you feel like you've been down the same road.
The end game is life saved. The end game is integration into society. I am not one to sit here and say, I think that it's going to be a perfect world because I don't really believe in perfection. But do I think that it's going to be tenfold better? Yeah.
We laid the groundwork. The voices are out there. We have the science. We have the data. We have to find and open the hearts. And I think those hearts want to be opened. I absolutely believe it.
If we were to be the face of Voice of Recovery and go tell our story, tell it every chance we got to everybody we came in touch with, we can reverse probably at least 50% of those people, make believers out. We're not going to get everybody to believe. That'll never happen. But by God, we can turn half of them around because those same people did not believe that a woman should vote. And if you go further back in history, them same people didn't believe that a black person should vote or be a citizen. So as history goes by, history's on our side. History will show one day who and what we are. So I say we make history. That's what I say.
In my opinion, the best slogan when it comes to addiction isn't found in some church basement or in some book. It's a phrase 6 gay activists from New York City coined in 1987 in the midst of the AIDS crisis. Silence equals death. I won't stay silent any longer. I hope you won't either.
You can go, you can start all over again. You could try to find a way to make another day go by. You can hide, hold all your feelings inside. You could try to carry on when all you wanna do is cry. And maybe someday we'll figure all this out. Try to find a way to make things better now. And maybe someday we'll live our lives out loud. We'll be better off somehow. Someday. Now wait and try to find another mistake. If you throw it all away, then maybe you could change your mind. You can run, and when everything is over and done, you could shine a little light on everything around you. Man, it's good to be someone. And maybe someday we'll figure all this out. Try to put an end to all our doubt. Try to find a way to make things better now. And maybe someday we'll live our lives out loud. We'll be better off somehow. Someday. And I don't wanna wait, I just wanna know. I just wanna hear you tell me so. Give it to me straight, tell it to me slow. 'Cause maybe someday we'll figure all this out. We'll put an end to all our doubt. Try to find a way to just feel better now. And maybe